everybody. Welcome to the Flawed Theology Podcast. I'm Phil.
And I'm Suzie, and we're asking the question, if your theology were wrong, wouldn't you want to know?
All right, so we're recording this episode the day after the big solar eclipse. And, well, you had a better solar eclipse experience than I did because you guys went to experience totality. How was that?
It was indescribable. And the photos that you see online do not accurately portray what it was like to see it with your eyes.
Yeah.
I did not know what it was going to be like. So you can have 95% totality and even 99%, and it still does not get you that experience of totality. It changes in that 1% to something completely different.
Yeah.
I told you it was indescribable. I'm having difficulty finding the words.
Yeah.
But it felt like a gift that the universe had given me. And that sounds so dumb. I know it sounds dumb.
Yeah.
But you didn't experience it, totality.
I only got 89% here, so
yeah,
it was cool, but yeah, it wasn't the same. I mean, I watched some videos of it happening live, and you hear the crowd react, but yeah,
it was like being at a sporting event.
Yeah, I heard some other people talking about it and how they were able to see other deep space objects, because of the moon and the sun being obscure, that you can now easily see them. And the thing that struck them was that you could see the perspective of how far away they were, as opposed to like how sometimes you can see planets. Like you can go outside right now and look up, and if it's clear, you can see Venus and Jupiter on any given night. But like something that happens during the total eclipse is different. Like you get a different perspective. Did you notice that?
I didn't notice any other heavenly bodies. No.
Oh, you didn't? Okay.
Where we were, totality was only 90 seconds.
Okay.
But it felt like 30 seconds. It blew by.
Yeah.
I wish I could experience it all again to soak it all in. But you could see features all around. Like we saw flares, and it was so bright, bright.
Yeah.
But dark everywhere. It was like it looked like it was sunset. But then when you look up, it's like this fire in the sky. It was just amazing. Can't even describe it.
My older kids went with their bio dad out to Indiana to see it.
Oh, that's awesome.
So they got to experience. I haven't really had a chance to talk to them about it yet because they just got back today. So
I'm curious what they'll say, because my daughter said it was the best day of her life. Granted, she's only 8, and so she hasn't had very many days.
That's okay.
But that still says a lot.
Yeah. Well, and the other thing that's interesting about the eclipse that is, of course, has been building up this whole thing is like there's been all kinds of talk about, well, the rapture is going to happen on April 8th.
Mm-hmm.
It's funny to me, like how every significant celestial event or any major naturally explainable event like earthquakes or whatever, the automatic jump to so many people is to some bigger thing, something with a spiritual meaning. And it's so freeing to experience those things now without having that baggage.
Right.
I can imagine how that would have felt 10 or 12 years ago if we would have had it and I would have been a super Christian. I would have been like, oh, this is it. It's so stupid now. Like you look at it, you're like,
yeah. So Marjorie Taylor Greene tweeted after the earthquake.
Yeah.
For those of you who don't know, there was an earthquake in New Jersey that was Friday, right?
Yes.
So I live in Maryland, and I felt it for like 5 seconds. It supposedly went on for a minute in New Jersey or New York. And Marjorie Taylor Greene tweeted, I don't have it in front of me, so I'm paraphrasing.
Yeah.
God is so mad at us. I pray that America wakes up and listens. God, he's punishing us. He's sending us a sign or something like that.
Yeah.
And I read this to my kids at the dinner table. I was like, guys, what do you think about this? And they were like, well, that's stupid, because eclipses, you can predict when they're going to happen. It doesn't mean God's mad at you. Does that mean he's going to be mad in 2033 in Alaska? And I was like, this is a great point. I'm glad you're thinking critically. How are you thinking more critically than a 49-year-old woman who's in Congress?
Right. Yeah, she posted something about God's trying to get our attention.
Yeah.
But there was a massive earthquake in Taiwan, like not a week earlier. That was like a 7.4 or 7.6.
Yep.
Like huge amounts of destruction, but that doesn't mean anything.
That doesn't matter.
The eclipses that will happen in 18 months, in South America that we won't see, those won't be prophetic.
It's that narcissism.
Right.
Yeah, it's only American Christianity that matters. Nothing else is happening, and anywhere else in the globe counts for anything.
Yeah. And this is really like a big flawed theology in real life. Like the whole eclipse thing, the talk about the rapture and like the apocalypse and, the judgment, everything's judgment. And then of course, today you hear crickets from all of those people that were talking about the rapture, or they're moving the goalposts to say, oh, we were spared.
I wondered about that.
The lady that put that big long post, I don't know if you saw it, the one she's like, I don't know everything, and then she proceeded to like word vomit about the cities of Nineveh and all that shit that was supposed to happen with the eclipse path and all that stuff. She came out already and posted as soon as the eclipse happened, saying it was just a sign, blah, blah, blah. The end isn't really here yet because, we don't know when it's going to happen, blah, blah, blah. Like, and no one picks up on that they're doing this all the time.
Yeah.
How many rapture predictions have there been? I think somebody posted some that there's been something like 74 of them since the rapture thing even started, which is only like 100 years ago.
That's crazy.
Like, these are all natural occurring events. Eclipses happen, I think, every 18 months in the world.
When we can predict it with such precision, there's no way it's a result of the anger of a god.
Right. Because I think NASA has the eclipses predicted all the way out to the year 3000.
Wow. Yeah. We see the comments about how the eclipse was so miraculous. God is so good. He knows what he's doing. It's
right.
God's beauty, or Jesus is so great. This was his gift to us. Well, what about the Taiwan earthquake that killed all these people?
Right. Yeah.
If God is so good, what about that?
Or the wildfires in Australia, like, all these things. There's all these things that happen every day. And if there's somebody that's in control, he's like really asleep at the wheel.
And there's two sides, and they both consider themselves Christian. But there's the one side that's like, the eclipse means God's angry and he wants us to listen. And the other side is like, the eclipse is a gift from God and it's so beautiful and amazing.
Yeah. How
but if they can't
both?
Even agree, yeah, it can't be both.
Yeah, it can't be both. Like, God's mad, but he's also giving us presents.
Flawed. The whole thing's flawed.
We are excited tonight to have a guest with us. Yet another guest that we stole from Stacy Gran. So we're just going to have to start sending her royalties for all our guests that we're excited to have Darante Lamar on. So Darante, welcome.
Thank you for having me. I am excited to be here.
We're excited to have you.
I told Darante before we started recording that I'm going to introduce him as the deepest voice in deconversion. So he said he was okay with that.
I am.
Don't adjust the bass on your recording. It's just Darante's super voice. So Darante, I heard you on one of Stacy's episodes and I was like, ooh, I need to talk to this guy because he's like, you got a lot to talk about. You had like a real infectious personality and you're really passionate about, what you're doing in the world. But before we kind of get to all that, why don't you tell us a little bit about your faith background? Because you're unique from a lot of the people that we've had on and that you were actually in full-time ministry and all that kind of stuff. So tell us a little bit about your faith background and all of that.
Yeah, I was one of those people. I guess I could call myself a part of the Joshua generation. And I think that's how I saw my salvation experience. I got saved very young, in very charismatic circles, in these circles where people are speaking in tongues, running around the church, laughing in the spirit and all that good stuff.
Nice.
And prophesying, that people are going to get houses, cars, and their husbands and their wives are coming and all that good stuff. And I was in love with it. I was infatuated with it. I can't be dishonest about it.
Yeah.
It was magical to me, because it was by contrast to what my family churches were, which they were Baptist and Methodist. This was like the God of superpowers. So I was feeling this guy because around this time I was into Dragon Ball Z and everything. And so this was like a God who could help you go to Super Saiyan. And I was I'm watching people do that every Sunday.
Right.
But I really did. I fell head over heels in love with the charismata. Or the charismatic movement, this idea that God is somehow active through people, that was very attractive to me. And that God can change people's lives. That was like, ooh, because I grew up in a type of situation where everybody's lives really did need to be changed. I really bought into this belief, and I don't think I realized it until after I deconverted. But this belief that without God, these people would be helpless. And I now realize how patronizing that really is and why some of that theology comes off very damaging. But I really believe that people could not change without the power of God, without the presence of God. And then when you don't believe in God, that's like, ooh, that's a doomy, gloomy way to look at the world.
Right.
So as a child, did you actually see people's lives changed and then you attributed it to God?
That's a great question. And I want to answer that clearly. And that is, I heard people testify that their lives had been changed. But the more I begin to pay attention, I didn't see a lot of changed lives because then the same people you saw testify that their lives were changed this Sunday, you're literally going to see them like the next Sunday or the Sunday after that. And it's the same testimony. And then you're like, oh, either these people have amnesia or this is, like this is just suspension of disbelief. And we're kind of playing into this thing over and over again, which was a struggle for me my entire, even being in ministry, it was a struggle because even though I was captivated with the charismata, I still wanted to understand it. And I found that it was kind of hard to get understanding because you can ask 10 different people and they're all going to give you 10 different things and say that they know for sure that their thing is the right thing. And that was hard to navigate.
Yeah. And where was this geographically that you grew up kind of?
The Bible Belt, Southeast Alabama.
Here we go. Okay. That's what I was kind of hoping you would say. Because I grew up like in New Jersey, but now I live in the South, but not the deep South. So I was curious. And were you in like an exclusively Black community, or was it a mixed community?
Ooh, great question. So at first it was exclusively Black, right? So the first little church I got saved in was a Pentecostal church. If anybody was in there that was not Black, they were probably very uncomfortable by the time the church service got started. As a matter of fact, I brought one of my white friends to that church service and a lady started screaming and running and he left.
Wow.
He was like, nope.
They're not ready for that, huh?
No.
Yeah. Well, it's the reason I asked that is because we had Robert from Affinis Humanity. I don't know if you know who he is, but he's kind of like a humanist advocate for education, but his perspective is also very much about like the impact of Christianity on Black culture.
Yes.
And how it's so different like culturally in the Black community. Could you talk a little bit about that, like in your experience?
Now, see, that's a hot topic for me. It's actually one of my favorite things
to
talk about.
Okay.
But because that's really one of the things that shook me out of, number one, belief, and then number two, silent atheism. Okay. Just watching how damaging this particular belief system. So before I deconverted, I noticed something about my Black contemporaries and my white contemporaries. And it was the way we interpreted scripture, at least in the charismatic movement. And I noticed that the majority of my Black churches viewed God or viewed Jesus as a suffering savior. And the majority of my white contemporaries viewed Jesus as a conquering king. And this thing really kind of stood out to me. One day I was watching a movie with one of my best friends, and it was, I wish I could remember the name of it, but Samuel L. Jackson is like a FBI or CIA guy who investigates terrorists, and he's like doing horrible things to this terrorist. And my white friend is like, yeah, that's what I want to do one day. And I was thinking like, oh,
damn,
really? That's not Christian, is it? But I begin to realize that for him, no, doing this for my country, for him, that's a part of his theology. That was not a part of my theology.
Right.
Doing anything like that was horrible. So that's when I first began to realize that, oh, snap, I think we're interpreting even Jesus differently. But it went beyond that. I began to notice that a lot of our messages in our services are very dependent. Like it creates this idea, like we have sayings in the Black church, like, won't he do it? And like, which means God is going to do it. And can't nobody do it but God. And he may not come when you want him, but he'll be there right on time. Like, what kind of sense does that even make? We've allowed our relationship with superstition to allow us to concretize anecdotes as truth.
Yeah.
And it is very dangerous. Even people from my community that leave the church, even when they leave religion, they don't always leave superstition. Like I grew up, it wasn't just church superstitions. It was don't step on the crack or you break your mama's back. It was don't split the pole, don't whistle in the house, don't have don't open the umbrella in the house. And while in some people's households, this was like a nice little joke. And growing up with me, you could beat for stuff like that. Like
right.
You violated this law. But we also believe stuff like if a child ran across the pulpit, God would strike him down. Now, you think those beliefs are silly, but then you have to begin to wonder, what does this do to a parent's view of their own child? What does this do for a parent who believes in that way, for the autonomy of that child, for the agency of that child? You teach this child to be afraid of the world, and that goes beyond just the theology. This child now literally begins to believe that their whole life is dictated by this unseen force. And here's the unintended consequence. What happens is, why should I even try?
Right.
And so one of the number one issues I see in my community, and I don't want to speak from everybody's perspective, but I can tell you what I've seen, is there is an overabundance of people who don't believe in themselves enough to try, because it is not I who live, but Christ who lives in me.
Right. What's the point of even like trying to get out of whatever situation you're in? Because you're in that situation because God put you there. If you're poor, if your dad's a crackhead, if your mom's getting beat by your dad, that's because there's some lesson that's supposed to be being taught. And then looking at that from the outside now, you look at it and you say, that is from Christianity. The world looks at that from the outside and they say, oh, that's just the Black community.
Oh,
But
no.
I mean, I remember Robert talking about these, saying like, this is taught to us culturally because of religion, and he was talking about how the Black community has assimilated that into their full culture, the slavery mindset, like.
I think the most dangerous thing that the Black mind receives from Christianity is that there is a set order for the world, is that things are established and you cannot change that. And so if it is God's will. And if you are to try to interfere with that, you put yourself at risk of interfering with God's will. So this belief that this world has been designed the way that it is, because in the Black mind, you have to wrestle with, if God is just, then why is my condition what it is, And in the way you reconcile that, unfortunately, because of our theology, is God is sovereign. He can do whatever he wants to do. And we have to learn how to accept that. Unfortunately, that also translates to how many of us approach social justice issues. So like, while we'll get together and love to say that we all marched, when you actually look at the statistics, many of our movements struggled because of the church, because the church was always there saying, don't get involved with that. That is going too far. Even Dr. King, he had to fight his own peers to be where he was. And to be honest, he had to be convinced to even take that statement, to take that stand. It was people like A. Philip Randolph, who was an atheist, who was organizing the civil rights movement. But because of the Black church propaganda, we don't get to learn about him. We don't get to learn about Stokely Carmichael and the work he does and that he brings, who was also a non-believer, or Bayard Rustin, who just starts to get his flowers, who was also a skeptic and a gay Black man who organized the March on Washington. But the church was able to literally subterfuge this whole thing and say, oh no, we did this. We did this because we're such great Christians. And that's just not how the narrative actually went down.
That's crazy, because those people that you just named, I've never heard of those people.
Same.
Wow.
Can you repeat them all, actually? Can you just repeat all those names?
Seriously.
Absolutely. That's A. Philip Randolph, literally organized the civil rights movement. He was Dr. King's mentor. He's the one that goes to Dr. King and says, you need to do this. He was an atheist. Everything you read about him will say that, because he was an avid atheist, which is why his name gets pushed to the back pages of history.
Right.
There is Stokely Carmichael, who was also called Kwame Ture. He was a Pan-Africanist as well as an atheist. He was the leader of SNCC at one time, which Student Nonviolent something. It's CC, but SNCC. And then the last one was Bayard Rustin, who they just did a Netflix movie on. He was a gay Black man who was absolutely skeptical in every way that it could be. He was a Christian by convenience. But he was the one who actually organized the March on Washington. But you notice that when you hear his Black history talked about, you do not hear our skeptics. For example, most people are familiar with the Harlem Renaissance. Most people don't know that whole movement was originally called the New Negro Movement and was orchestrated by a man by the name of Hubert Henry Harrison. During his time, he was known as the Black Socrates. He was also a Black atheist. But these people have been pushed. Their names have been hidden. I mean, but even W.B. Du Bois was a black atheist.
Yeah, I find that whole thing fascinating because in white communities, there's a latent racism, sometimes more outspoken, depending on where you are. I mean, I grew up in like New Jersey, so no one up there would ever admit that they were racist. But if you sat around at my family's like Thanksgiving table with my uncles who were Italian, they were super racist, you know, and we all just thought it was funny. And because I had my own internalized racism, I just thought it was funny.
Yeah.
You know, I went to a school in kindergarten that I was probably like the only white person there. It was all. And my parents used to actively like chastise me for talking like a black person.
Yep.
What?
Because when you hang around a certain group, they have a certain cadence to their voice and you start to, you know, kind of talk that way. And I would come home and I would say something and my parents would be like, why are you talking like that? And I remember what happened when I was a junior in high school and I liked a black girl at my Christian school that I went to. It was not well received.
I had that same experience.
So that whole like system, when you look at it from the white perspective and then growing out of that and becoming more progressive and learning about the civil rights movement, I learned about the civil rights movement from like a Christian perspective somewhat. You know, and when I was in progressive churches, Dr. King was put up on the big pedestal. But then you find out that he was kind of the voice, but he wasn't really the brains behind it, like you're saying. Like
also, when we interviewed Robert, he mentioned that he didn't believe literally a lot of the things that Christians believe. Like, I don't think he believed in hell. He might not have even believed in the resurrection, but he kind of had to buy in to mobilize the black church.
Well, see, and I can speak to that a little bit because here's a little secret. There's a high percentage of black preachers who do not believe what they preach. They themselves are kind of in chains to what their congregations believe. There are plenty of black preachers who would love to come out and say, hey, listen, there's no more sin. There's no more hell. One did. His name was Carlton Pearson. He was a mega pastor. He lost everything overnight. Everything. Yeah. And so black preachers have learned the hard way, you know, that if you want to survive, because most black, you know, I'm gonna X out the ones who are in it for the money and filthy lucre and the women and all of that. I'm gonna hone in right here on the ones who are literally in it because they love people and they think this is what they're doing, that what they're doing is helping people. Most of them would literally change their theology overnight if they knew that their congregations would support them. But that social environment does not exist. That mental flexibility doesn't exist as of now. In the black church, our sermons are like, it's still Sunday school. It's still the stuff, you know, it's, I still tell people this is ancestor worship. In the black church, theology is much different than I see it in other churches. It's really what we saw grandma and grandpa do. And the reason why we'd be offended if somebody say, hey, this might not be true, because then at that moment, you're telling me Big Mom lied to me. And you better not be talking about my big mama like that. And it's because we haven't been allowed, we've not even had anybody to interrogate our faith in that way, to have these type of conversations.
Yeah. Deconverting is very difficult for a lot of people. The deconstruction process is very hard, but it's for a black man like yourself, like Robert said, it was twice as difficult. When his black church family found out that he wasn't a believer anymore, he said it was worse than if he would have come out as being gay.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so like, talk about your experience there. Like what were some of the precipitating factors that started to chip away at your belief?
And also, first, were you a minister?
Yes, I was a pastor. All right. So I've been started as a youth pastor, youth minister, and became a minister of music, worship pastor, and then eventually a pastor. I pastored my own church, Actually, I pastored 3 churches, one of which that I pastored while I was an atheist, but that's a whole nother story. I was trying to do the right thing. It lasted 3 months. I resigned. Yes, I was a pastor. And what did it for me, I often tell people I was a Christian on credit, which means the whole time I was engaged in this process, I understood that I had not had solid reason to believe yet. But I was willing to participate on faith. And my idea was eventually I'm going to run into somebody who's going to be able to help to answer some of these hard questions.
It's like we have the same brain or something. I swear. Sorry to interrupt.
No,
I'm just
I
like
love
in
it.
awe. Everything you're saying is like, oh my gosh, this is my experience.
Wow.
So even in ministry for you, like you had like a certain amount of like head knowledge of the Bible and all and the theology and you could convey it adequately to people, but there was still something in there nagging you that was like, oh, I need someone to kind of put this last puzzle in piece so I can really fully believe this.
I
Like,
wish I could say it was like one piece. It was so
Yeah.
many pieces. And it was
36,000
like the
pieces.
more that I went on, the more pieces it was. And
Mhm.
so like I could never buy the inerrancy of scripture because everybody had a different opinion. So I'm like, this can't be inerrant if everybody thinks something different about it. At the very least, that means it's not even clear.
Right.
Right.
But I could kind of rationalize that at the time by saying, well, the Bible itself doesn't make the claim of inerrancy. The Bible itself doesn't make the claim of it being authoritative. The Bible itself just literally exists as some books.
Mhm.
The inerrancy and authoritativeness, that's presupposed by what these preachers who I honored told me about it when they introduced me to it.
Right.
And so I could kind of scapegoat out of certain things for a while, but I was still hoping that somebody's going to tell me, like, can you explain to me how Moses is real and yet writes his own death?
Right.
Can you explain to me how Moses really lived in Egypt and was raised by Pharaoh and yet doesn't know Pharaoh's name? Or can you explain to me how we know that the translation of the Red Sea is inaccurate and yet we keep printing it?
Yes.
That seems dishonest to me.
Absolutely. It's
You
the Reed
know?
Sea.
Ooh.
Yeah.
How old were you when you had your first doubt? Like the first time you were like, wait a minute, this doesn't add up.
Okay, here's the funny thing. I had doubts before I became a Christian. So my first doubts came when I got in trouble at school and I had an aunt that made me read the book of Genesis and then write the book of Genesis. And so my doubts kicked in at the talking snake. Soon as we got there, I was like, oh, wait a minute. This feels more like Hercules, like a story of Zeus or something like that.
Right.
And so at that moment, I was like, yeah, I think this is just something they read for like poetry or something, and maybe there's some good, it's like Shakespeare, sure.
Right.
But when I got to the Pentecostal church, then I was like, oh, well, this God moves people. So maybe there's something I'm missing.
Mhm.
Maybe there's a greater meaning behind this talking snake, or maybe there really was a time that snakes talked and I
Right.
just don't have enough information. But if these preachers are up here saying this with all of this audacity and these people believe it, then because at that time I'm still young enough, when I got saved, I was around 11 or 12. I'm still young enough to believe that people know what the hell they're doing.
Mhm.
And so I was just like, these adults, they know they would not be pretending. These adults would not be pretending. Well, after 20 years of ministry, I can tell you, yeah, they are. They are all pretending. And I know that because I've had to counsel many of them who are in the services on Sunday morning saying, I know I hear the voice of God and God is speaking to me right now. And he's telling me to tell you. Many of those same people I've had to counsel in private saying, why doesn't God speak to me?
Mhm.
And my question becomes, how do you deal with that dissonance? How do
Right.
you deal with at one point telling people that, hey, God is telling me to tell you this, and then you're in my office crying, bawling your eyes out, saying I'm crying out to God every night and he's not talking to me.
Mm.
And so then I realized that people are pretending.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's the thing that most people don't know that goes on behind the scenes. And when you're in ministry, you see all that stuff. Part of me thinks, well, are they pretending or do they really believe it? Or is it a mixture? Like if you would have asked me, I was never a pastor, but I was a pastor's kid, and I grew up like in the church, and then I was a worship leader, youth minister, camp pastor, that kind of stuff. There was never a time where I would have said I didn't believe it. No matter what crying out that I would have done with no answers or whatever, I would have never said that I didn't believe it. So how much of it do you think is that they believe it, but it's because they want to? And is some of it malicious where they're like, well, I say I believe it, so I have to live it that way?
Well, see, I think they're pretending because they believe it. I know for me, it was, okay, I'm going to justify God by faith. So I'm going to do this out of faith. I mean, that's the invitation. And so even by doing those things out of faith, and I think there was a certain movement in the church that phrased it just right. The entire experience with Christianity becomes fake it till you make it. Like I don't feel anything making me lift my hands, but you're telling me to lift my hands. And if I lift my hands, I'll feel something eventually.
Right.
And truth be told, I will, because and it's nothing supernatural. There's actually a natural phenomenon that's taking place because we're singing together. My dopamine levels are rising. The cortisol is being released. My endorphins are running. But then someone is going to be there who's going to tell me, well, that's Jesus. They're not going to tell me that's biology, that's chemistry, and this is something you can do singing whatever the hell you want to sing. They're going to tell you this only happens when you're in the presence of this almighty Father.
How did you go from being a believer and having questions to then getting into ministry? Because it's a pretty big jump to go from being even if you're a hardcore believer, sold out, on fire, all that stuff. It's a pretty big jump to then go to ministry and then to full-time ministry. Like,
great question.
How'd you get there?
Well, my mother was a crack addict and my father was not present. And so I grew up in the 80s and the early 90s, and life was horrible. And I really saw just a lot of the ugliness of the world. And so when this God of power was introduced to me, the God who could change the world and change people's lives, I wanted to sign up for this God. So my moment of conversion came through my mother getting demons cast out of her. And so I was like, holy crap, if this guy can get demons out of her, then yes, I will serve you for freaking life, because yikes, she was crazy. Yeah. So, which apparently it didn't take. I
was just about to ask, how are the long-term outcomes of that exorcism?
Did not take at all. As a matter of fact, shortly after that, I got saved, got filled with the Holy Spirit with the evidence of speaking in tongues, and she kicked me out the same night because I didn't buy her alcohol. So, the dissonance is real. Yeah. And I kept serving God after that. Like, I literally got saved because the demons got, cast out of her. And I didn't rethink this when the demons came back. I should have asked for, let me,
can I get a refund?
Right. But because I believe that this God was, was going to give me superpowers to do stuff like that, to impact people's lives like that, I wanted to serve him. And so I immediately started reading my Bible more and more and more, watching all Christian television. And truth be told, I feel like I got radicalized by everything that I was just kind of watching and listening to. It's like, hey, you're chosen. And then because, I've always been kind of charismatic, and then, my parents wasn't, with me in church. Churches were really attracted to me. Churches are attracted to orphans. Somebody should look into that. Yeah. But, churches were really attracted to me and really love to, oh, you're anointed, you're going to be a prophet to the nations and stuff like that. And it definitely made me feel this sense of like, oh man, maybe this little insignificant Black kid from Alabama has a purpose after all. And it was like, my mom didn't have a purpose for me. My dad didn't have a purpose for me. I was like a non-factor for most of my family. So it was like, God has a purpose for me. And apparently that purpose comes with a title. And some people like these titles. It was infatuating. And so it was immediate. From the moment I got saved, shortly after that, I'm in my school with my Bible telling other people about this experience. I'm praying for people. I've gotten other people filled with the Holy Spirit with the evidence of speaking in tongues in the hallways and the corridors and the stairwells of my schools, middle schools, and high schools, because I thought I was saving the world. And I thought I was fulfilling God's plan. But the hard part was the whole way through, I just kept having these moments of watching things to say, well, that doesn't make sense. And like, why are we doing this? It was an interesting journey.
So it's like a lot of like you almost like self-indoctrinated yourself because it gave you an identity.
Yes.
Like where you didn't have one before. Of course, you're going to logically go into a profession that can take it to the world. That makes perfect sense because that's who you are.
But you always had this side of you that intellectually was measuring things and weighing things and processing things and realizing that things didn't add up. did you have any kind of guilt or shame about the doubts that you sometimes felt? Speaking from experience, because I also had doubts starting very early and continuing through adulthood, and I tried to fake it until I made it. I never, ever made it until I decided to stop faking it. The shame kind of went away after that, but it was present for like the first 37 years of my life.
I would say that the first 28 years of my life, I definitely had it. And a part of it, it was the voice of family, friends, and other ministers who had told me that my curiosity was anti-God. It was heretical. It was demonic. It was devilish. I was labeled the Antichrist the first year I was saved. Like it was a rough experience. And so I really began to, kind of believe that, Darante, these thoughts you're having in your mind, that's really the devil. This inquisitive nature you have, that's really the devil. And if anything pisses me off about my relationship with Christianity, it's that. It is that, because when you rob a person of their ability and even desire to question, you rob them of their capacity to engage intellectually with the world around them. And it was like that's what I woke up from. I was like, you freaking robbed me, or I robbed myself even of my ability to understand what the hell I'm living through, which is why I've been making all of these horrible freaking decisions, because I'm not critically engaging the world. And once I did, it was like a breath of fresh air. So it was like, fuck shame, fuck guilt, doesn't matter anymore. I want to be free, and I have kids, and I don't want to condemn them to what I lived through.
Yes. The euphoria that I felt when I deconverted and gave myself permission to think whatever I wanted, to research whatever I wanted. Nothing was off limits. That was the kind of euphoria that people say they get from being saved. And I grew up Lutheran, so I never had, I was never saved because that wasn't a thing that we did.
Right.
And so I never had that experience. But that was my moment of being saved from religion.
Yes.
I think it's so funny what you said about curiosity. They said that because you were so curious, you were the Antichrist. I have no words for that. That's incredible.
I wonder if that's unique to the Black church too, because in some of the churches I grew up in, they like to pretend that asking questions was okay.
Yeah.
Oh, you want to be like a Berean, and ask all the questions and don't just take the pastor's word for it. Go home and search it for yourself. But if you actually did go home and search it for yourself and then came back with a question that wasn't in line with the theology, well, then you're the Antichrist. Wait, you told me the question, but then if I don't come up with the same answers as you, then I'm wrong. I'm doubting. I'm not living by faith. When I was growing up, I was always backsliding,
Always going backwards.
So you get into ministry. Talk a little bit about the different kind of ministry things you got into, and then where were you as far as ministry when the cracks started to really get too big to handle?
Well, I can tell you the first big crack. The first big crack, I was a associate minister at a fairly large church, and I was also the youth minister of music. And at this time, I was about 17 years old. And this was a fairly large church, and it was a mixed church. Like a lot of folk, it wasn't just white and black. It was Hispanic. It was Italian, which I know is white, but not always. There was a time.
I claim Italian, not white. Just
right.
To keep me out of trouble.
Right. And so it was actually a beautiful church experience, and that church was very much charismatic. They brought in people like Benny Hinn and Rod Parsley to preach and stuff, and they believed in stuff like healing the sick, raising the dead, and things of that nature. And I also believe that. I read up on people like John G. Lake, Smith Wigglesworth, Lester Sumrall, and I was absolutely, because again, I like the God of power. Now, if your God didn't have power, then I had no reason to believe in it.
Right.
So this God of power was attractive to me. And so reading these stories, believing nobody will lie about these things, right? So reading these stories about people raising people from the dead and holding the bubonic plague in their own hands, and the disease dies in their hand. That was the story of John G. Lake. He did it. Lester Sumrall goes into a funeral and pulls a man out of the casket and throws him against the wall. And the man starts walking and comes back alive, like Weekend at Bernie's, but better. But, so I bought into these stories, and my pastor was preaching these stories, and he was a great man from Chicago, and I loved him. And then he died while preaching these stories. He was in the middle of a series where he was adamant about God's gifts were back and in full effect. And we should be raising the dead. And when he was preaching this series, people were getting healed of all types of illnesses that couldn't be verified. But, I wouldn't have explained it that way then.
Right.
But people were getting healed. Then he died. I got that call around 6 o'clock in the morning because I was just getting off of work from Walmart. I was an overnight stalker. And so make sure I say that, stalker, not stalker.
Right.
So I get the call. I get the call and they're like, hey, Pastor David has died. And I'm like, okay, when are we going to raise him up?
Right.
That was a non-starter. Nobody was going to raise him up.
Wow.
They were immediately fighting over who was going to be next to take his position.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember going into my prayer closet that day and like crying for like a straight hour because I couldn't understand how all of these people just the previous Sunday, Pastor David died on a Monday, so that was just yesterday. All of these people were crying at the altar but talking about how they believed God was able to do these things. And we had just saw someone healed of glaucoma and all this other things. And none of those people who had participated in these moments prior were ready to engage this healing opportunities, this resurrection opportunity. This is what we say we believe. And I mean, we said we believed it. This was an every Sunday thing. That was hard for me to reconcile because at this moment, I cannot separate your behavior from your belief. If you tell me this is what we believe, but then when you have an opportunity for your behavior to demonstrate that, it's like, it wasn't just that, like only a handful did. Nobody did.
Mm-mm.
I felt like the fool.
Right.
It was that moment where I looked around and said, so am I the only one that really thought this was a thing?
That's
and
crazy.
You were at age 17 when that happened. So you had this huge crack that formed. And then you went on to become a minister. So did you just kind of ignore that crack and pretend it wasn't there? Did you try to fill it with caulk or something?
I assumed my theology was flawed.
You blamed yourself.
Yep. After that, I withdrew from the idea that God heals or raises the dead. Because it was that, and it was also because I had been a part of I was a healing guy for a minute, and I had at the same year did a little revival where two boys had come up who had cast on, and I prayed for them, and they took the cast off, and the whole church goes, hey. And I remember being back at home in my bedroom thinking like, but I don't know anything about what happened. I don't know how long they had those cast on. I don't know if they had broken arms or fractures. I don't know if this was the week the cast was supposed to come off, or the week after, or the week before. There's so many variables, and it began to bother me that nobody else was asking. And then just kind of conflating that with this Pastor David issue, I began to realize that a lot of the people that were my contemporaries were not engaging these questions at all. But here's the messed up part. I just bought that to mean that I was special, that I'm seeing something that others can't see right now. That's why God wants to use me the way he's using me. He wants me to see these things so that I can understand it. And then I can craft the theology the way that it's supposed to be. Now, I wouldn't have used those words, but that's literally what I was trying to do. I was trying to craft a version of God that actually worked. And I think that's what every believer is trying to do at the end of the day, until they realize that, holy crap, this doesn't work.
Can't be done.
Right. Yeah, they're trying to make God into their own image.
Yep.
When you just build your own God, it's like a little Lego set. You're like, well, my God can do this, but then how's the guy down the street have a totally different God, that does something totally different? And then a critical thinker says, oh, well, that can't be right because one of you has to be wrong, or both of you have to be wrong, or all 40,000 versions of you have to be wrong.
I grew up Lutheran, and my sister around age 20 converted to Seventh-day Adventist, and my mom, obviously still firmly Lutheran. They would have debates where they would sit, and I would sit in the middle. They would throw verses at each other, like why each of them was right.
Yep.
And I'm just sitting there in the middle, like looking back and forth, like, how am I supposed to know which one's right?
Yeah.
What if you're both wrong? And if we can't tell, what's the value of this at all?
Right.
If we can't tell, how valuable is God? How valuable is God's communication if we can't tell which way is the right way?
And both were in earnest. Both really wanted to know the truth. It's not like they had bad intentions. They both had good intentions.
Right.
But it's just impossible to discern objectively what the true message is of the Bible.
Yep.
Yeah. What kind of God would just leave it up to us? Like,
Right.
If we're flawed human beings.
yeah, if he's all knowing and, all powerful, it seems like he could have done a better job in getting his point across than just throwing down a book that anybody can interpret any way they want. Right.
That was definitely a thing for me in my latter years as a pastor, especially as I just kind of left the Bible first. It was just like, wait a minute, if God wanted us to have a Bible, why didn't he give it to Adam? and then after, man just messed up everything, apparently, why not give it to Noah?
Right.
And then you had a chance to give it to Moses and you only give him 10 commandments. And then Jesus was on the earth for 33 years and he never writes a book.
Yeah.
And so it's the more you think about it, this guy isn't very competent. He's not I'm a project manager by day. And this guy would not have a job on any of my projects.
No.
That reminds me of a video that I watched of yours, a recent one about hell.
Ooh.
And you said something in that video that was so jaw-dropping for me. It gave me chills. I had to stop and get my notebook and write it down. You said, and you were referring to heaven and hell and logistically how it doesn't make sense. And you said, a God who is incapable of maintaining justice in this world will likely be just as incompetent in the next world. I was like, holy crap, that's so true. If somebody had just said that to me at like age 12, I would have been like, oh yeah, you're right. None of this is true. Like, just give me that permission. Explain this to me in a way that is so clear.
Yep.
If anybody has a lingering fear of hell, they need to go watch that video. It is one of the best ones I've seen on hell.
Oh, wow. Thank you. What was interesting about that is even while doing that video, I had a thought that I had never had before. And it was just like, holy crap, he didn't just mess up earth. He also messed up heaven. There was a war in heaven. There's a war in heaven. This guy is majorly incompetent.
Yeah. How could you have a war in heaven? Yeah. And then, of course, the Christians will say, well, that's because even in heaven, they had free will. But the same argument against free will that you have on earth is the same as in heaven. Yep. How could they have free will if you had foreknowledge of everything that was going to happen? You're like,
oh, man.
And the fact that hell exists at all shows that God failed.
Right.
Yes. Yes.
It's like so clear when it's just explained like that. I wish somebody had explained it to me like that.
Oh, yeah. I wish someone would have given me the freedom just to think about it like that. Or just to think, just to engage it with all the nuances, whatever it is. And I don't think I ever realized that, I was my family were not saved. They were Christians, but they were not saved. They were drunkards and sleeper people and all of that. Nobody was saved.
Right.
So it's crazy that these people who were not even saved felt it necessary to indoctrinate their children in such a way to say, don't think anything else other than this. And just kind of going back to that difference in the Black community, there's another thing. It's also because if you think different, somebody might kill you. If you think different, you might not get the job. If you're Black and you're atheist, if you're Black and you don't fit the status quo, which is why you'll notice, and this may be a controversial sentence, you'll notice a lot of what gets packaged as Black culture is just mainstream popularity, because the whole idea becomes don't stand out too much. Don't deviate from what is popular. And which makes it very hard to be an intellectual as a Black child, because then you do get picked on because you're different. You don't align with what Big Mama said. You don't align with Uncle JoJo said. You question things. And so to kind of feel safe in the Black community, you have to be both religious and sometimes you got to turn down your light a little bit. It hurts to say it out loud, but that's the life I've lived. The first 28 years of my life, I had to pretend like I had no interest in other things. But, I had to constantly defend me not being interested in certain types of music. I had to constantly defend me not being interested in sports. I had to constantly defend me not wanting to do things that I didn't have reason to want to do. And that was hard. But then what I realized is that the profession that I was a part of was what was creating that trap. That a lot of our messages were definitely anti-difference, was definitely anti-intellect. I mean, we literally preached it don't matter how much you know. My great aunt, when her daughter graduated from college, years ago, and I said, oh, Aunt Steph graduated from college. She said, that don't mean shit.
Mm.
This was common. This is what many of people in my community, in my particular context, this is how they view education. Because the thing that they're all so terrified of is someone else feeling like they're better than them.
Uh-huh.
And then I finally realized after I kind of deconverted, like, damn, how toxic do you have to be to think that nobody can be better than you? Like, you're not out here killing the game. Like, godly, you're not Michael Jordan and you're out here like, oh, nobody can be better than me. No, that's superstition. To even believe that somebody couldn't be better than, there are people better than me at plenty of things. Because I'm not defined by one thing. There are people who are better at managing money than me. I'm a musician, and there are musicians who can play me under the table. As an atheist, I have the freedom not to be offended by that, because I no longer feel that I am fearfully and wonderfully made and just, created this perfect emblem of perfection. Instead, I realize I am a freaking evolved primate who gets to evolve a little bit more every day. And so when I find somebody that's better than me, it's not offensive. It's enlightening, because people can do what people do. And so when I see another person doing something that I can't do yet, it's actually incredibly inspiring for me.
Wow. That's a nice way to look at it.
And it also goes back to that whole self-esteem thing. You've actually got a whole community. And as a child, you're actually a kid with no self-esteem, but you're being taught that you're the best thing on the planet at the same time. And Christianity teaches you that you're shit, but you're awesome at the same time.
Imposter syndrome, right?
Yeah, and the only reason you're awesome is because you have God. It's no wonder everyone doesn't just have such a perseverated personality, of like, I'm a piece of shit, but I'm a child of God at the same time. Like,
I'm wonderfully made.
Yeah.
There's a song by an artist called Maddie Zahn, and it's called If It Wasn't God. And that is like one of the most powerful thoughts, because what you do end up realizing when you deconvert is that, all of those nice things I did, all of the good things I did that I actually value as good, that was actually me.
Mm-hmm.
That wasn't, my imaginary friend. It was actually me. I am capable of being a good person without any extra voices in my head. And I think that's a weird thing to have to come to realize.
Yeah. I have a pipe dream of getting Maddie Zahn's music as our theme music somehow, because all her stuff is so powerful. Like if you watch any of her videos, even just the way she interacts with people in shows, if you ever watched her videos, she's down on her knees on the edge of the stage, talking to people. And you're like, oh man, that's it's just so powerful what she does.
I think it's what we always wanted church to be.
Right.
like something real, something tangible, something human, know? And Maddie does a great job of really pouring that out there. It's beautiful.
Yeah, she's awesome. So you mentioned kind of some of these cracks. Was there, a lot of people say, that deconversion and deconstruction, it's a death by 1,000 cuts, which you kind of alliterated to. Was there a final cut that kind of just put you over the edge?
Yep. The death of Trayvon Martin and Mike Brown in the United States, and me watching my contemporaries commercialize it. By that time, I was rubbing shoulders with a lot of major players in the Black church, and many of them went out of their way to commercialize this event. They preached sermons about it and crafted entire sermon series about it, created really fancy flyers about it, which is why I'm so good at flyers, church planning 101. It's just something we had to do.
Right.
But when it came to coming to the table to talk about how do we prevent this going forward, how do we build infrastructure in our community, how do we attack education issues in our community, there was no conversation. The conversation was, let's just pray and trust God. And then you even found, what I found to be even more insidious, was that even though we were willing to commercialize it, most preachers did not have a real opinion on the matter whatsoever. Were not capable of having thoughts. And that sounds odd unless you've ever read Carter G. Woodson or Booker T. Washington, which are both figures from the early 1900s, and Carter G. Woodson is the father of Black history. But they both had a lot of strong opinions about the Black church, and none of them were good. Because what you ultimately end up getting, and this is a nice way I can see it, is D-level students who get an opportunity to be popular. And that's what a lot of our churches have allowed, and that's what has created so much pseudo intelligence and pseudo confidence in a lot of our communities. Because at the end of the day, it's not grounded in nothing, and I saw that firsthand. And it wasn't just in the way that they mishandled that. What I realized is that even when they were trying to be sincere, they had no ability to grasp the issues. That was frightening for me.
When you say they commercialized it, what was the message that they sent? Because like that was really powerful for me too, because it actually a lot of the whole Black Lives Matter movement was enlightening to me in my own racism, my own entrenched racism that I didn't realize that I had. So I'm curious, like, what was the message that they were sending? What were they selling?
It kind of goes back to an earlier point that that we discussed, and that the message was, we're down for the cause. The message was, we're out here involved. So for like 6 weeks at a time, preachers would get in their pulpits for 6 weeks back to back and preach how we're super duper concerned about what's going on. And we have a mandate, an obligation, we have a calling to be involved. But then it's really just to get people interested in your church for those 6 weeks. And after those 6 weeks are over, you're never going to talk about it again.
And get involved in what cause?
It was like when Trayvon died, a bunch of pastors did a sermon series where they're on the cover of the sermons, of the promotional, with a bottle of Arizona tea and your Skittles, and this is their way of saying, I identify with you. And I want to point this out, because this is pandering, right? And this is what bothered me, because we're going to preach for 6 weeks and just say, we need to stand up, we need to do better. But what I found is that this was no different than what politicians do when they come to our community. I'm going to say something to you in a language that I know you appreciate, and then I'm not going to offer you anything after that, because I know that this is all I had to do. And the reason that's all I had to do, because the cultural context of growing up is depend on anecdotes, not evidence. So it doesn't matter if someone follows through on what they said they were going to do. All that matters is that they said the magic words.
So there's no real activism where you're like, we need to go out and address the systemic racism in the police force.
We need to preach about it. It's not even we need to go out. It's just we need to preach about it, and we need to pray about it, and we need to sing songs about it. And then let's do a special giveaway and say we're doing the giveaway because of it. But then if you bring someone in the room who's actually an activist and say, hey, well, we actually need to be doing this, the first thing you're going to hear is like, oh, well, we don't do that. This is our lane. We're the church. We pray.
It's almost as bad as anybody who just says they care about any social justice issue but doesn't do jack shit about it, but
the thoughts and prayers,
but talk about it in thoughts and prayers. Yeah, it's like the same thing. Like, oh, I'm heartbroken that these people have been killed, but I'm not going to do anything to prevent it. We're not going to talk about why it actually happened.
Nope.
Was there like self-victimization too? Like, this is the lot that we've drawn as our community, and there's nothing we can do about it?
Because I mean, that's a part of Black theology, is that there's a someday, and that someday is not today. That someday God is going to deliver. Someday God is going to be just. Someday God is going. So one day the first will be last, and the last will be first.
That's the whole theme of the Bible, right there.
It is, right?
That's the whole Bible.
Yeah. So that whole thing basically pushed you over the edge to say, say what? I'm out of the church. I'm out of belief.
Well, the conversation I had, because there were some other factors playing into play at the same time. I was in a very disappointing marriage. And at this time, my church was falling apart. I was losing my faith. I just graduated with my bachelor's degree. And I was looking at my life, and I'm like, my life doesn't make sense. My life is at that moment was ultimately miserable. And I was like, but I follow your law. I follow your word. I've done everything right. And I'm watching people who I know we're not doing it right. And I ain't saying it because I thought I was better than them, because they're sending me the videos of them not doing it right, if you know what I'm saying. Okay. So like I know what other people are doing, and I'm trying to figure out, like, God, how have I offended you in such a way that, my life is not here? And then coupled with watching, my other pastor friends, it became, maybe you're sitting at the children's table and you've ignored that voice in your head telling you that these people don't know what the hell they're talking about or what the hell they're doing. And you have lived your entire life ignoring good sense. And that's where I was at 28. And it wasn't even an angry place. It was like, holy shit. I think I just wasted the past 2 decades of my life. I think the reason my life is the way that it is not because God didn't do, or God did do, or the devil didn't do, or the devil did do. It's because I wasn't paying attention to reality. I was believing that things worked differently than the way things actually worked. I was believing that if I give enough, if I pray enough, if I sacrifice enough, if I just, be obedient to God, that then God will, this supernatural God would naturally make things okay. And what I realized is that the God of my theology no longer even lived in nature. And which ultimately meant, like, dude, your God is absolutely irrelevant. If he doesn't live in nature, he has no ability to impact nature whatsoever. And so I had my last conversation with God that day. And that was in 2014. And it was like, hey, if you're going to know me, you're going to have to do it like you did it to Adam. And if you don't
Yeah.
do it like that, this conversation, this relationship is over.
Yeah,
Wow.
you realize it's a one-way conversation.
Yes.
You're like, I've been doing all the damn talking, and then I've been making up the answers on the other side of the freaking phone.
Yes.
It's like you were playing a game, like a computer game, but you had the wrong controller, or you didn't know what the buttons did, and so you like thought you could press this button to do one thing, but then you realized you were doing it wrong the whole time,
The whole
and that's
time.
why you were sucked at the game.
Yeah.
Yep. Yep.
Wow.
So, what do you view now, like kind of on the other side of faith, are like some of the most damaging aspects of religion and or faith? Like,
I feel that religious superstition is an absolute assault on human autonomy, human agency, and human capacity. If you believe about yourself that you are nothing, or that you are nothing without God, or that without God you can't, or without God's plan or God's will, you can't know anything, you will literally live a life never really exploring yourself or your own capacity. And what absolutely breaks my heart is now realizing how many people have gone to the grave, never really exploring their lives, never really seeing what they could have done, never, like, one of the most heartbreaking things for me in 2014 was realizing, like, dude, you literally believe that the only thing you could be was a preacher. Like,
right.
that hurts. Like, especially now that I've seen all the type of thing. Like, I taught myself how to program, how to computer code. And I'm like, I would have never done that as a pastor, because I just had automatically believed that these things were beyond me, and that there was this other thing that God wanted my attention. And so, like, it, that the most damaging thing is that people lose control of themselves. They lose a desire to even know their own selves, and lose a desire to really explore what they can do. I think one of the saddest things in my community is I'm surrounded by people who won't even try. I can pull up charts of, here's good ideas, here's things you can do, and they've already convinced themselves. And it's not just them, it's years and decades of socialization, and it's also the communities that they're a part of, and the relationships that they have. But they just already believe that there are certain things that are off limits to them. And so in the Black community, it is definitely assault on capacity. But for other people, it's the assault for everybody else, it's the assault on autonomy. That I don't even have the right to feel the way that I feel about the way that I experience life, that I have to subject that to somebody else's imaginary friend. So if I feel like something is wrong, I have to say, well, if God doesn't feel like it's wrong, it's not wrong.
Right.
Nobody can learn that way. That's not healthy.
Yeah, it's very destructive. Yeah. When you finally did decide to walk away, well, let me rephrase that because I don't feel like people decide to walk away. I feel like you get to a place that you just can't believe anymore. Would you agree with that statement? Like,
oh, absolutely.
So when you could not believe anymore, what was did you have any kind of fallout from that?
I think I'd call it more, well, hold up. I did have a big fallout. Like I almost lost my freedom. And that was before they even knew I was an atheist. They just knew I believed differently. At that time, I had decided to stop pastoring, but I was still working for a Christian organization. So I was working for the Southern Baptist Convention at the time, which was a weird pivot. But I thought it would be safe. That's a weird thing. Just saying the words doesn't even sound right.
Right.
But
especially considering what's coming out in the Southern Baptist Convention recently. So
yes.
Yeah.
Well, as soon as they got wind that there was something different about my belief, and I think it just has something to do with Santa Claus. I got fired in like one of the most like heinous ways, and then like got accused of a bunch of crimes that I didn't commit.
Oh, Jesus.
But for 3 years of my life, had to live like I did because that's how long the court case took. I didn't have a lawyer, didn't have money for a lawyer. I was always broke, very broke most of my life. So I literally had to fight that court case myself. Did end up winning, but it took forever, and my career took a hit. Like my college degree meant nothing for 3 years because there was a pending felony on my record, and it was all because my beliefs were different. But you would think that would be the worst part of the story. No. When I called my family members and let them know what was going on, and they said, well, why are these people doing that? And I'd say, well, it's because I don't believe in Jesus anymore. Well, maybe this is God's will.
Oh, shit. I was waiting for that.
So that's why I said, like, fallout work-wise, because that impacted my family. I have a family of 6. We have 4 kids. That impacted my family horrendously. My economics, oh my goodness, it was a nightmare. But everything else, I did not consider that fallout. I considered that realization. I just now know who you are.
Yeah, that's crazy. So was this the church that basically accused you of criminal stuff, and then you had to defend yourself?
Yes, it was a church association, the Calhoun Baptist Association for Alabama, Anniston, Alabama. And it was literally just one guy. The first charge was harassment. I got called to pick up my last check, and when I got there to pick it up, the doors were locked, and they were standing on the other side laughing at me. I literally just said, "You're a jackass," and I left. By the time I got home, the sheriff was there and said, "Hey, there's a warrant for your arrest because you've harassed somebody."
Oh my God.
I said, "All right, let's go. I don't mind because, I'm somewhat of a smart person, so I know I can go down here. We'll do this process. I'll have my day in court, right?"
Right.
But we go down there, 6 hours pass, and then I'm like, okay, what's going on? And it's like, oh, well, you'll be staying overnight because you've been put on suicide watch. I was like, what? And then the next day, they added 3 other charges. Like it was like theft of property and 2 other things. And I was like, whoa, what is going on? And of course, my wife spent all night like kind of boycotting or protesting, the jail cell. The next day, I was able to get out only after the guy who signed off on the suicide watch to keep me overnight had to admit that he wasn't even on the premises when he signed off. And that someone had called him and told him that based on some of my Facebook posts, that they had reason to be concerned. And because he trusted that person as a good friend, he thought that he should follow their suggestion. That is what he explained to me the next day, that I should understand why he robbed me of life and liberty for a night, because it was a good friend. And if he had not followed through on his friend's advice, he could have been putting my life in jeopardy.
Wow. I'm speechless because this also goes to the whole fucked up nature of the justice system, because I mean, I don't want to assume things, but I'm assuming that your Southern Baptist, loving Christian people were all old white guys.
They were.
And here's young, intelligent black man that they're like, we're going to fuck this guy.
Yeah.
And you knowing that you were a black man were like, well, I'm not going to fight this, or I'm going to wind up on the pavement like the people that we've been watching on TV for the past 5 years.
Yes.
That's the very definition of the systemic shit that the whole black community has to deal with. And then where did it come from? The fucking church.
That's it.
Just like you were saying before. Like, I mean, that's a very real thing. Like, that's an actual, like, that's not anecdote. That's like, you lived that shit. Like,
that's right.
Yeah, that's crazy. Well, you're muted. Suzanne, you're muted.
All right. How long have I been muted?
The whole time you were talking.
What I was saying was that they say they're so persecuted, but yet they are not being framed for felonies just because they believe.
Right.
But he's being framed for felonies because he does not believe. So who's being persecuted?
Yeah, and the nice big long list of Southern Baptist pastors that have been sexually abusing people for decades. What kind of repercussions are they getting? Are any of them in jail? Not a fucking one of them. Half of them are still in the pulpit. It's the black man that's the criminal. Like,
and what was interesting is like a year before my trial concluded, they ended up finding out that one of the administrative assistants had stolen like $300,000.
Hello.
And no one had even knew. But because they were trying to ramp up so much evidence against me, they ended up stumbling across that instead.
Well, that's hilarious.
That's really ironic. I love that.
Right?
Karma's a real bitch sometimes.
Yes.
Let's transition to kind of like your life now as a, kind of a in the deconversion space. You have like a lot of different content in the bio that you sent me. I didn't realize this at all, that you've written several books, and then you've got a YouTube channel. Like, talk a little bit about your YouTube channel and kind of like what you're trying to accomplish there.
It's really for me to just breathe, because I've lived as a closet atheist for 10 years, for an entire decade. I've only had these conversations with my wife and my children, which the beauty is I have a whole house filled with non-believers. So it's very comfortable here for me.
That's good.
Kids, yeah. Well, the moment I told my kids that Santa wasn't real, that kind of did it for them. There was like, so these other guys, they're not real either, huh?
Was your family Christian this whole time that you were in ministry, or were they all just like, oh, that's how daddy pays the bills?
Everybody were believers, because in the black context, it's the head, whatever mommy and daddy is, everybody else is. But the moment that daddy deconverted and mommy deconverted, it just gave our kids the freedom to be honest with us.
Okay.
It gave them the freedom, because it was like, okay, mommy and daddy are not going to be mad at us if we say this. And so it was like, hey, we didn't really believe it anyway, which made sense, because when I was their ages, I didn't really believe it either. I had to be kind of coaxed into it. And we had made the decision that obviously we weren't going to do that,
Right.
If they would have chosen to believe something, I want to say I wouldn't have tried to talk them out of it, but I don't think I'm being honest there.
Yeah. So was your wife, did she deconvert along with you pretty easily, or did she kind of did she lag behind?
Well, all right. So wife number one did not.
Okay.
My departure from the faith cost me my first marriage. And I don't want to say that in an overly traumatic way. I was not very heartbroken over that. It was like, yeah, this isn't gonna work. I don't believe this, and I'm not gonna live a life where I pretend to believe it, at least not at home. I'll pretend to believe it for a paycheck. Oh my goodness. At that moment, I was like, I gotta get paid. I got kids.
Right.
But so wife number one, no, she, to this day, she is still like, you are the devil, you're the Antichrist, because you don't believe in God anymore. and it took me forever to get custody of my kids because of that. Because we have 2 kids together, and then we have a blended family. My new wife had 2 kids, and my other wife had 2 kids. And I say new wife, and it's odd because we've been married 9 years now. My new wife, when we got together, I wasn't 100% honest about atheism, because I was like, we're black, and black people can't be atheists. That at least that's the way we talk about it.
Right.
But I did let her know I was no longer a pastor. I didn't feel comfortable being introduced to people as a pastor, and that my theology was nothing like any other Christians. And she was really cool with it, which we had known each other since 9th grade. So I should kind of give that context. But she had her whole relationship with me had been, he's a Christian, he's a preacher. And then she was like, not only is he a Christian or a preacher, but he's like a stern one. He's very strict, you know. So she was elated to actually kind of figure out that I had chilled out a little bit. Like she wouldn't date me in high school because I was too staunch. And it was right before we got married where I said, okay, I got to be honest with you. I don't believe in God, and I want to give you the opportunity to call it off if you think that's a deal breaker. And she was just like, boy, stop, you know. So I described my wife as she grew up, she was culturally religious, but she was never like committed to the cause. Like she had issues with church. The thing for her was she didn't like the way Christians treated people. So she had created her own personal theology anyway, that God is good by whatever definition I believe is good. Mm-hmm. So if I believe it's wrong to mistreat people, then God doesn't mistreat people, you know, and that was just kind of her rationality. And because of that, by the time her and I had that conversation, she was like, well, that doesn't really matter to me. And then after she articulated that out loud, she was like, oh no, wait a minute. It really doesn't matter to me. I don't think I believe in this either. Mm-hmm. But now her mother is still firmly involved in ministry. Her mother is an evangelist and all that stuff. So she doesn't feel comfortable calling herself an atheist, but she will call herself an agnostic. Mm-hmm. But in the house, she's an atheist, you know.
Right. Let's get back to your YouTube channel and your content. Like you were mentioning that it's about breathing. And you said, I think in your first video, this is for me.
Yep. Like a lot of it is just like to figure out if I'm crazy or not, right? You know, because like a lot of these things, you know, I've been having in my head, like for 10 years, I've been thinking about these things. And I used to tell my wife, sometimes I feel like I'm beautiful minding it. Like I'm literally just writing scribble scrabble and everybody just like, oh, that's so cute. And they're just too afraid to tell me that, bruh, you are off the rails.
Right.
You know, I wanted to share some things to see if there were other people who could resonate with what I was saying, because and there's some self-esteem stuff there too, because I was, you know, my whole life has been as a preacher has been I preach people amen, and there's my value. Mm-hmm. And so I went 10 years without having anybody to amen or co-sign my thoughts, and that's a really hard struggle. So it's just like, oh my God, how do I determine if what I'm saying is okay or wrong? And then like 2023 hit last year, and I was just like, I don't care anymore. This is a horrible way to live. And I need to find community. Which brings me to the second part. It was like my network has struggled. I don't have people to talk to because everybody around me believes in Noah's flood, or that the you know, or that the earth is only 6,000 years old. And it's just like, holy crap, I can't have any serious conversations with people. So this really was my channel. It was an outlet for me to breathe and find community and to see if these things that I've been running through my head, if these ideas actually resonate with anybody else but me. And so, you know, in a very shallow way, I was just looking for my tribe, looking for people that I could be in a room with and feel comfortable and feel like I don't have to hide who I am to be in this room, and that I don't have to agree with every word you say to still feel comfortable in this room. It's been beautiful.
One of the things you lose when you get out of Christianity is that community.
Yeah.
Because it's ready made, you know. So then when you get out, it's like, okay, well, how am I going to build this again? And most of us have never really been taught how to actually build a community because it's already there. You know, you had a little experience because you were like a church planter. So building a community, even an online one, that then eventually translates into meeting real people. And that's what's awesome about being on podcasts and stuff. Is like, we've heard so many people's stories, and they all in some way, shape, or form just echo our story. So it's a validation. Yes. You know, there's millions of people that are deconverting and deconstructing their beliefs because of the internet.
Yeah.
You know, the internet basically fucked God over big time. You know, like he didn't see the internet coming, apparently, in his omniscience.
He should have been much more concerned about the internet than the Tower of Babel. That's for sure.
Yeah.
Should have killed off Al Gore when he had the chance. You know?
Al Gore. Yeah. Well, I think that your story is really going to resonate with a lot of our listeners. You seem like you had a struggle between this emotional side that wanted that identity and wanted the hope. And then you also had this really analytical side.
Yes.
that was fighting that. And for a long time, the first part won. And then at some point, the other part took over. That is a struggle that I think a lot of us encounter. I did. I wasn't as strong on like the identity and the hope side. I was always a little more apathetic toward Christianity, and it kind of wished like it didn't exist. But that is really a war that takes place in a lot of our brains.
Yeah.
It just makes me feel a lot less alone, that I know that there were also other analytical kids out there who maybe felt a little lonely. Like, why am I the only one struggling here? How come everybody else can believe this without question?
Right.
And just like you, I fell back on well, I guess they know what they're talking about. My parents wouldn't lie to me. My pastors wouldn't lie to me. You know, my uncle's a pastor and I love him. And there's no way he would be mistaken about this. That kept me going for a long time.
Right.
But it wasn't enough. It was not enough.
Well, it's interesting because like that whole when you learn about the concept of cognitive dissonance,
Yes,
that's really what makes things start to crumble. Because when I learned that term when I was deconstructing, I don't think I even knew I was deconstructing at the time. But someone used the word cognitive dissonance, and I was like, "Well, what the fuck is that?" First of all, I'd never heard of the term at all, and I was a psych major in freaking college. Of course, my Christian college never heard cognitive dissonance.
They don't want you to know about it. That's why.
No, of course not. You know, so like I heard about it's that tension of holding two conflicting ideas and then somehow just making your own resolution for it. And eventually that causes some real problems.
Yeah.
That's all that's happening with people is they're realizing, oh, well, what I thought was true and what is actually true in reality are two very different things. At some point, you have to pick which one you're going to go. Like, are you going to pick the faith that has no evidence, or are you going to pick here's how the world really works? And most people on the deconversion side have picked how the world really works. Show them what they've won, you know?
That's right. Suspension of disbelief. I was sitting in a drama class, drama 101, and the professor said, yeah, there's this thing we do called suspension of disbelief. And I was like, oh, what's that? And it's like when you give yourself permission to believe something that you know isn't true. And I was like, oh, I think that's what I'm doing.
Oh, no.
You're like, they're talking about acting. You're talking about, oh, shit, that's my whole life.
That's my whole life.
Wow.
Yes.
I never related those two before, but yeah.
And you're doing it subconsciously. And that's the whole thing. It's like you've been programmed to do that. You know, we were talking earlier about the eclipse, you know, from yesterday and how much crazy shit has been circulating about the eclipse. And I would have been one of these people. I mean, I don't know that I would have been that cuckoo to think that the intersecting lines of the eclipse meant that the rapture was going to happen at that X, because that seems fucking dumb. But I had some pretty high level rapture anxiety.
Yes.
Which I'm sure in your community was the same too, because the rapture is a big old thing. It's funny to watch, but it's also so disturbing to watch that there's like perfectly good, rational people that go to work every day in high level jobs and teach kids and raise families, that they actually thought and are continually thinking, well, the world is going to come to an end and I can't fucking wait.
Yeah. It can't end soon enough.
Yeah, it's just crazy to me. Like,
and there's another side to that. Like, and that was something that shook me out of silent atheism, realizing how many people, if like a being came and said, I'm going to destroy the planet, realizing how many people would sign up to be on that being's side. I was like, holy crap, this is scary. But then another thing for me, again, coming from that Black context, you know, in my community, we have a lot of issues with absent fathers, or at least that's the story. And so then when you consider moments like this, I encourage people to consider that nuance, that you have a whole church who is waiting for the return of its absent father. And when you're dealing with the people that has been their reality, that has been their lives, it actually makes them more accepting of a pattern of behavior that is intolerable, because this now excuses absence. This gives you all types of justification for why a father would not be there for their children. And I've seen that a lot of times in my community, that it's not just somebody runs off doing something stupid. Many times people have really solid religious reasons as to why they are not there for their children and their families. But they get that example from God, because if you can justify God's absence, you can justify anybody's absence.
Yeah, That makes perfect sense.
Wow.
And then look at like the moms that have to go and explain where daddy went.
Yep.
And they're going to make up a whole story that also doesn't make daddy look bad.
Right.
Even though dad's a piece of shit.
Yes.
He might be. But mom's got to make sure that, you don't have a bad view of your dad because culture again.
Yep.
And then you do the same thing with God. Like, what all the bad shit that God did? Well, that's okay because he's got a big
God
plan.
can drown kids because he's God,
Right.
He can do that stuff.
He had a bigger plan, and all that stuff.
I wish I had a bigger plan so I can get away with stuff.
I know, right? I always like to ask people, like, what advice, or do you have any advice for people who are questioning their beliefs, and or do you have like resources that you have found to be helpful that might be helpful to other people? So,
okay, this is a funny resource, but I think it's amazing. Crash Course. There's a YouTube channel, Crash Course, and they just have a little bit of everything: philosophy courses, astronomy courses, a little bit of everything. For people who've had questions, I suggest there's a lot of places to find those answers, but Crash Course is a good place to start, especially their course on philosophy, because they go through so many courses about logical fallacies, about people who've made arguments for God, arguments for heaven, arguments for hell. All of their videos are less than 10 minutes. And it's really helpful information, and there's no agenda to get you not to believe or to believe. They're just sharing the history of information. And so I've found that very helpful for people of all ages. Advice? Okay. Where do I start? Now let me stop. The biggest thing is, it's just like, hey, perfection is a fucking mythology. Doesn't exist. You are literally a fucking primate on this planet learning. And so that's the best you can do, is like literally learn. Don't hold yourself accountable to things that you have no evidence of being. In perfection, we have no evidence of anything perfect ever. And the reason I say that is because what you will find often is the biggest challenge against intellectual development is the fascination with perfection. The moment a person either becomes afraid of not being perfect, or they become afraid of someone knowing that they're not perfect. And either way, it keeps them from taking the risks that they need to take in order to learn. It's like playing Super Mario Brothers, and you get to that hole for the first time, and you're so terrified of falling in that you don't even try. And that's where a lot of people live at nowadays, because they're afraid you're going to see me fall. And the truth of the matter is, we're all out here falling. There's not one of us out here that are out here not falling into a hole at some point.
right.
And the truth of the matter is, the people who do the best in life have fell in the most holes. So at some point, you just got to get used to it and be willing to learn from it.
That's really good.
I feel like you're talking directly to me.
Yeah.
I needed to hear that.
Yeah, that's good
I'm a
stuff.
perfectionist.
There's your amen. We'll give you an amen. You haven't had
Amen.
one for 10 years. Put that on your amen tracker.
You're so quotable. I'm compiling quotes. I've been writing them down.
Oh, thank you.
Gonna make a quotes page.
Yeah.
And forgive me if I say thank you a lot. There was a time in my life where I didn't say thank you. Anytime anybody would ever give me a compliment, it was always glory to God. Glory to God.
Yeah.
And so now I've gotten comfortable just saying, no, thank you. Thank you. It was a compliment. I appreciate it. I did something good. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yes, you're welcome. Kudos to you.
That's awesome. All right. So lastly, tell us where people can find you on social media.
Awesome. I can be found anywhere just by Darante Lamar. That's my first and middle name. I'm Darante Lamar X on Twitter. Sorry, it's X now. I'm not on there a lot. I'm still trying to get reacclimated to social media. Obviously, I was a pastor 10 years ago, so my crowds were a little different. And so I'm having to kind of recultivate. But on Facebook, I'm pretty active, and I'm Darante Lamar there. TikTok, I'm getting in there. I'm also Darante Lamar there. Literally, Darante Lamar everywhere you can find me, because I think I'm the only person in the world with that name so far. With that combination, there's
that works out good.
Darantes, but I think I'm the only Darante Lamar. And even if you find me on Amazon, I'm there. I don't have any atheist-based books yet, but they are coming. But my first book, my first book was just called Significant. If you read it, you can clearly see, oh, this guy is leaving the faith. because it was about me learning how to critically engage my life and realizing that, holy crap, my life is not, I'm not significant, not because I'm insignificant. It's because I'm not making significant decisions, and I'm not making significant risks. And that feeling of insignificance is not the world's judgment of me. It's my own judgment of me. It's me looking at myself, knowing like, dude, you could be doing more, and you're not. And so that book was kind of that journey through that.
Cool. Yeah. And you have a couple other books on there too. So yeah, we'll post the whole link to all, unless the other books are too Jesus-y and you don't want us to put them out there.
Nope, they're not Jesus-y at all.
Okay.
The other one is Memphis. It's a novel, and there's like it was, like Personal Project. It's a novel about politics, thriller, and sex. So there's not Jesus-y
that sounds
at all.
fun.
No Jesus there. I'm gonna add these to the list. So yeah, we'll post all this stuff in the show notes. Any last thoughts? Any last bits of wisdom you want to share?
If I did have any any last minute wisdom, and it's the freedom I've found over the past 10 years, and that's just do what makes sense. Literally. And that's what we've been doing in our marriage. We don't have anything called submission in our marriage. We're committed to each other. Like, submission doesn't exist. Like, we're two adults. You do what you want to do. We both, whatever we do, there's consequences. That's what we know. Like, that's how we live. Our children kind of have autonomy to be themselves and to discover themselves. We don't, there's really only one rule in my house, and that's don't lie to me. And the reason that's a rule is because if you lie to me, I feel that means I've done something to lose your trust, and I don't want to live there. But I just, godly, I love our lives as atheists. It's the most freeing I've ever been able to live in my entire life.
Yeah. I was going to say that earlier. They sometimes say, like, you'll know if it's true by the fruits or by the peace that you feel. Yep. Well, I never felt any peace before. Yes. And now that I'm out, I feel oodles of peace.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Oodles. It's everywhere.
They'll be like, oh, that's fake peace, though. I can't be real peace, because you didn't have God, so.
Right.
All right. Well, Darante, I appreciate you joining us tonight.
Yes. Thank you.
Thank you.
And I'm glad we stole you from Stacy. And we'll continue to steal her podcast guests until she catches on.
She picks the best guest, man.
Yeah.
Her and D are amazing.
Yeah, and she does it live, and then we'll take those people, and then we'll edit them and make them sound really, really good. Yeah. So,
hey, that's it. That's how you corner the market.
yeah. So, all right, we appreciate you being here. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Flawed Theology Podcast. I'm Phil.
And I'm Suzie. Tune in next time where we will continue to tackle the question, if your theology were wrong, wouldn't you want to know?
Be sure to join us on our Facebook group, Dangerous Questions, and follow us at flawedtheologypodcast.com. Subscribe wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. Rate and review the podcast on Google, Spotify, Apple. Those reviews are really cool, and we like to hear from them. So until next time, keep asking the dangerous questions.
See you next time.